Station about political telephone calls. People are getting flooded with these recorded calls and saying, what can we do about it? Can't we have a do not call list? And I understand one has now come up and been introduced in the Senate.
That is true. Senator from Pickens introduced a bill to allow people to opt out of receiving those calls. I decided to co-sponsor it with him. The federal do not call list was really successful, but it doesn't include political calls. So we figured, hey, here in South Carolina, people ought to have the option of saying, no mas, we don't want it anymore.
What do you think of that?
Well, I understand the bill was introduced this week. I've not had a chance to look at it. I do have some constitutional concerns about free speech, but I respect the concerns of the voters. And perhaps the real test of this is the discipline of people who are involved in running for public office as to how often and under what circumstances would we do this. And perhaps this debate will be healthy for that.
The House leadership has introduced a bill concerning our roads and bridges. One thing they want to do is to dedicate some money. I think the sales tax on new cars, they want to have that dedicated to that. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think trying to put highway dollars from highway transactions, whether it be gas or cars, makes sense. I think the real challenge will be whether there's enough catch-up money in that sort of revenue stream to do that. I also want to make sure that we don't in our haste to make more dollars that direction, raise taxes additionally on car transactions. I think that might be a real dangerous road to go down. So,
Senator Sheheen?
Well, I think it is fair to put money that's related to gas on roads, and we do that currently. Almost all of that is used for it. The amount of money they've talked about taking from the sales tax on vehicle sales is really not enough to make a big difference. And that money has to come out of somewhere else in the budget. That's a legitimate debate for us to have every year, but I don't think we should just say, okay, this money is going to be set aside for roads. You know, the question that the Senator alluded to, which is that right now is a $300 sales tax cap on cars. The question is it fair for a man that buys a $6,000 car to pay the same sales tax as a person who buys a $60,000 car, which is currently the state? I don't think that's right. I think if we're going to have a tax break, it ought to be for the people on the lower end who really need it. But that's a debate that perhaps we'll get into, perhaps.
So what kind of tax would you come up with? You wouldn't make the $60,000 car man pay the full tax on that, would you?
No, I would have if you asked Ritchie, in the ideal world, we'd have a tax credit on the car from $0 to $10,000, and you wouldn't pay any tax on that. And then we'd have a reasonable sales tax above that. Some states have 2%, some states have 1%, some states have 3%, so that we could make the math work. Right now, it's kind of perverse. We give the tax break to the person that buys the airplane or the yacht or the $60,000 car, and the person who buys the $6,000 car gets no tax break.
Senator Ritchie, what do you think of that?
well, I think that sounds interesting on its face, but the problem is this. The vast majority of car sales in this state, the value of the car is between $6,000 and $9,000. And that's roughly equal to the tax. So if you exempt the first $10,000 of car purchases, you're exempting 90% of all the purchases in this state. So I think that would be unworkable. But I do think some graduated scale may be appropriate. But I think we have to look at where the car transactions really are, what the values of the car is compared to where the taxes are.
Yeah, I'm sure people are sitting at home saying, you know, hey, I don't think it's fair that a guy that buys a $75,000 Mercedes or an airplane pays the same tax on it that I pay on my $20,000 car.
And I understand that, and I think that's something we can debate. I think we also ought to remember that those folks who pay for the more expensive car pay a lot more in property taxes on that. So there is a recognition of the value on the property tax side. The transactional tax, I think we can look at.
Yeah. Cigarette tax is another issue that will likely come up. In fact, there's some legislation out there. But the governor has said he would only sign something that has an offsetting tax otherwise, such as in the sales tax area. What's your view on that?
Well, the governor's been very explicit in saying it has to be an income tax swap, if you will, so it's revenue neutral. I think the Senate's bias is towards health care, whether it be access for small businesses and individuals who are uninsured at this point. And we can do that through a tax credit process, which I think will meet the governor's goals of giving tax relief. But I really think the challenges in this state are access to quality health care and access to insurance. And I think that's our bias, I think, in the Senate.
Does it make sense to try to pass something that's different from what the governor has said he favors if it seems likely that he's going to veto it unless you have a veto-proof passage? Well,
I think, of course, it does. We have a responsibility to do what we think's right, and if the Senate comes to a decision as a whole or as a majority that the cigarette tax needs to be raised and that it needs to go into health care, because in the long term that'll save us a lot of money in this state and in our state coffers. And we've got an obligation to do that, and if the governor vetoes it, then we'll see what happens.
I think the governor's overarching principle is don't grow government. Don't raise a tax just to spend more money. And I think we recognize that in the Republican caucus, and we want to work with him. But I think the bias would be to have a tax credit for health care insurance rather than a straight roll-off on any other tax.
The governor also wants to cut $20 or $21 million in health care funds for children. What's your view of that?
My view of that is that's just another example of very short-sighted ideas in this state. We've got a habit of trying to save a little bit of money today so that we can spend a whole lot more money as taxpayers tomorrow. It's not a good way to run your government. It's not a good way to run a business. Not a good way to run your personal life. If you invest in your children's health care, over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll save way much more money than that in their health care long term. So we need to take the long view in this state, and we don't do that. I hope that we'll continue to fund health care for children so that we can avoid long-term costs.
As I understand it, for that money, you get a 3 or 4 to 1 match from the federal government.
That's right. You do get a 3 to 4 to 1 match for Medicaid money that goes for health care, which means we're getting that much more money from our taxpayer dollars, our federal taxpayer dollars, which we pay plenty of them, back into the state, into our economy, into our health care workers, into people who work in that industry. And I'd hate to turn away millions and millions of dollars of our taxpayer dollars that we could bring back to this state.
Senator Ritchie, I don't think I've heard a single lawmaker who supports that.
Supports the governor's veto?
Proposal. The governor's proposal of cutting that money for the children's health care.
Well, I think we supported the idea last year of not raising the eligibility.
Right.
And I think that was supported also in Washington when it came through. To tell you the truth, we have not taken that issue up in our debates this year about the governor's rolling down, if you will, the eligibility. But I think we'll debate that and see how it looks. I've not had a chance to really look at it.
How much of a strain does it, or how much of a difference in debating the budget is there when you have so much less money this year than you did? It's
much easier.
It's easier.
It is.
There's not as many things you can think about and talk about.
Well, you get the chance to focus on the fundamentals.
Right.
And when you can do that and not hurt the taxpayers, I think that's what we really have to pay attention to. If we are going to have a roll-off in the economy, I think the overarching goals of the Senate would be, first, don't raise taxes to make it worse. And secondly, do the fundamentals correctly and don't add new programs.
I think it's true. I've said before that a tightening of the belt, whether it's forced or voluntary, is usually good for the state. Now, drastic cuts to the bone are usually not helpful to the state. Hopefully, our budget this year won't result in drastic cuts, but a belt tightening is always helpful with the state government.
What is your top priority going into this legislative year?
My top priority is a Government Accountability Act, which I've introduced, that would do a number of things, would force the legislature to look over programs and agencies to see if they're working, create an inspector general to try to root out any waste and fraud and abuse that's there, and give the governor more authority in administrative functions. So I'm going to be pushing that bill very hard this year. I've already met with the Senate leadership and some House members about it and trying to move it forward.
Is this taking some of the offices of the Budget and Control Board and moving it under the governor's office?
It does do that. It also creates obligations with the legislature to hold hearings on agencies annually and whenever we hear problems to try to see whether we're really spending our dollars on programs that are working or whether they're just continuing on. So it would really, I like to say, empower our legislative body and our executive body, both of which need some pumping up.
About 20 seconds for that.
My highest goal right now is to get the Illegal Immigration Reform Act passed. I think it's fundamental to the future of this state, and its costs address all the other issues that we have, and we want to focus on that.
Senator Ritchie, Senator Sheheen, thanks so much for coming over. Hope we can have you back on Newswatch, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.